Hello, hello. So our first presentation this morning is by a delightful trio from Deloitte Digital in the UK. Carol Jung is joining us from her hometown here in Wellington. She's actually just over there in the studio. While Georgia Chetwynd Talbot and Matt Cobham are streaming in from London. Together, they're going to walk us through their experience of delivering the UK's COVID-19 national testing service. Over to you guys.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Hello and welcome everyone. I've had the privilege of spending the last 3 months at home in Aotearoa, New Zealand. This is my first trip back home since the pandemic kicked off, and as someone who usually comes home every summer, I can't help but think back to this time last year when Georgia, Matt and I were in the throes of a dark and depressing UK winter, helping the UK respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we reflect on our role in designing, delivering and scaling the UK's rapid mass testing service. "2020, across the world, the pandemic resulted in a seismic shift in how we live, work and play. In the UK in September 2020, there were fears that a second wave of infections was impending. On the 6th of September, 3 months since restrictions from the first lockdown had been lifted, 2,988 COVID cases were confirmed in the UK, the highest number reported on a single day since the 22nd of May. At this time, almost 348,000 cases had been confirmed in the UK, with the total number of deaths also rising to over 41,000. For comparison, since the pandemic began, the UK has had a total of 18 million positive cases and almost 160,000 deaths within 28 days of a positive test. At the time, the National Health Service, the NHS, was experiencing ongoing pressure, and the test and trace service was struggling to keep up with demand for COVID tests. Additionally, studies were showing that at least 1 in 3 people who were infected with COVID-19 were asymptomatic. And on top of this, the UK had gone into recession for the first time in 11 years, and the government was well aware that a second national lockdown would have disastrous financial consequences for the UK, and it was doing everything in its power to avoid that scenario. Meanwhile, the race around the world to develop viable vaccines was continuing. As a result, the UK government announced a plan to regularly test the entire UK population. It was reported that Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, believed that a mass testing program named Operation Moonshot was the UK's only hope for avoiding a second national lockdown before a vaccine. The program itself aimed to deliver 10 million tests per day by 2021, giving it the capacity to test the entire population of the UK each week, helping businesses, workplaces, schools and universities continue to operate and allowing sports, entertainment and events to resume. We recognise that given the different policy settings, population size, density of living, amongst other factors, the context that the UK was operating in is very different to what New Zealand has and will go through. However, our talk today will share some of our key learnings in applying human-centred design in crisis as part of this mass testing program, where uncertainty and changing priorities was the norm and an expedited pace of delivery was essential. I'm Carol Jung, and I lead some of our most complex user-centred design projects at Deloitte Digital in the UK. During my time on mass testing and subsequently the test and trace program, I was one of the product design leads for lateral flow testing.
Kia ora, I'm Georgia Chetwynd Talbot. I also practice service design at Deloitte Digital here in London, as well as large-scale digital transformations. I worked on the same team as Carol and Cobby on mass testing, where I was responsible for the design of the testing service and led program research and continuous improvement activities.
Kia ora koutou. I'm Cobby. I too am a service designer in Deloitte Digital's London office. I was also lucky enough to work alongside Carol and G on the mass testing program, where I supported the design and prototyping of the test sites, as well as the scaling of the service across the UK. So to test 10 million people, we need to know what we're testing for. There are many different types of tests or the COVID testing technologies. All of them require a different setup to use them, and all of them tell us something different. Two of the main testing types that became widely used were the polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, and lateral flow technology, or LFT. In New Zealand, you may know LFTs as the rapid antigen tests that you can purchase from the pharmacy. The difference between these two tests is the PCR requires a laboratory process to test for minute traces of RNA, very similar to DNA, and it determines if someone is infected with the virus. On average, COVID can be present in someone's body for up to 90 days. On the other hand, an LFT produces a result rapidly, often within 15 to 30 minutes, and the tests it tests for the presence of antigens, which are only detectable when someone is infectious. On average, this is about a 5-day period. Because of this, LFTs are an effective means of mitigating the risk of transmission in people who are pre-symptomatic or even asymptomatic. We created an asymptomatic test site, an ATS, that used LFTs to support the UK's response to the pandemic and help keep essential workplaces open.
To provide everyone with a visual reference of what we built and how we built it, we have a video we'll play, and this is going to give you a walkthrough of the first asymptomatic testing site that we stood up in the warehouse of a national logistics centre. So we were tasked with designing and piloting a physical testing site that you can see here that could be stood up in a wide variety of essential workplaces across the UK before scaling up to communities and other institutions. The testing site needed to allow many people to move through at the start of a shift, receive a lateral flow test, take the test then and there, hand their sample over to a staff member operating the test site, who would process their results, as you can see here, whilst that employee left the testing site to await their results. So the test could be rapidly processed, as Cobby has explained, and as you can see here in the video, and any positive test results identified, and then those employees who tested positive without symptoms were able to exit their workplace and self-isolate. Simultaneously, this physical testing site was underpinned by a digital journey, and this enabled two things. It enabled an individual to create an account or log into their account, register the unique number of their particular test, and it also enabled staff operating the test site to register the result of their test, again using a digital solution, which would link the employee's unique test number with their result. And this data would enter the broader test and trace system. A key learning for us in the early days of designing this system was that sometimes you just need to be there and build it. In this case, we were designing for end users and end users alone, rather than any broader stakeholder groups. We therefore needed a very robust understanding of user needs and behaviours to design the clinical protocol, the supporting operations, and of course the physical testing sites themselves. So our team immediately started to identify pilot sites that would allow us to physically be there, talk to staff whilst we experimented in the very early days of the service design. This service was just too hard to theorise. Nobody had lived experience of a pandemic testing site anywhere in the world. And this was also an innately physical experience. So nobody could tell us about it or give us feedback of their experience without touching it, feeling it, seeing it, and experiencing it directly themselves. So we needed physical space to design with end users in order to effectively experiment. We did try and go virtual in the early days, but it was quickly identified that this just wasn't going to be appropriate for this design process. we did some virtual prototyping, so storyboarding, some clickable prototypes of the digital solution, mock-up spatial designs. And whilst this was helpful for us as a small design team, it just wasn't going to work and give us the data that we needed. Being on site enabled us to really understand the context that users worked in. This was also critical to balance the clinical process with actual lived experience and practicalities. If we had given these pilot sites just a dry clinical standard operating procedure, a lot of really important adjustments would have been missed. A good example of this is that a lot of these sites are very noisy, so factory floors and big logistics warehouses, but the clinical protocol called for a really, really thick perspex screen to be in the booth between the tester and the site operator. And this led to people leaning forward and over the screen and really shouting in order to get instructions. By seeing this in person, we could rapidly produce some visual signage using really basic cartoon drawings and train the operators to mime how to take the swab, thereby avoiding risk of transmission. This was also useful given we were developing the first instances of a modular design. This model needed to be lifted and shifted to a really wide range of spaces: pig abattoirs, offices, supermarkets, nightclubs. So physically seeing it come together helped us to determine what elements of the site were essential, what could be removed, what could be changed to fit a space, and by how much. We needed to move really fast to respond to an urgent need, but that didn't mean that our MVP could be rubbish. The testing prototypes we created were used for actual COVID testing, so there was zero room for error. The MVP couldn't compromise testing integrity. So I'm going to walk you through a list of some of the things we did to ensure we could deliver a really robust MVP. Firstly, we prototyped using a physical service walkthrough straight away. It was challenging to dive into this because that's quite a sophisticated stage of prototyping normally, but we were able to use a kind of lo-fi version of it in the early days. And we did this by just grabbing cardboard boxes and pallets and any old thing we could find in the warehouse, and then really rapidly prototype that service walkthrough using those bits and pieces. Secondly, we had to really push ourselves to focus on designing the right thing, not the best thing. So we challenged ourselves to prototype just enough to get what we needed and then move on. We were really deliberate about what hypotheses we were trying to test in an exercise, focusing just on our riskiest assumptions and not indulging in open-ended research or focusing on things that were already pretty certain. We also deployed role-playing as a precursor to live testing, so walking through testing scenarios with the employees who would be the site operatives. And this was really helpful in ironing out the kinks of the underpinning site protocols. And it was really helpful to train people to run through some what-if scenarios before they were actually live on the floor with people testing. A couple of other things that probably seem quite obvious, but were really essential. We engaged clinicians really early to stress test our MVP design. And we also had accredited testers use a train-the-trainer model to upskill the employees who would be operatives. All of this meant that our MVP, whilst basic and purely functional, was clinically really robust and really safe to operate.
As Georgia mentioned, there was a rapid need for the service. We were providing something that businesses and organisations were absolutely desperate for, given the urgency to keep services and businesses running during the pandemic. However, that isn't easy to do when requirements and priorities were constantly changing. For example, we were on the ground and our testing technology hadn't actually been decided yet. And also, no one had ever responded to such a problem at such a scale ever before anywhere in the world. So this necessitated a different approach to a national healthcare intervention. And we applied what was traditionally associated with software and technology delivery, product-led Agile delivery, to a large-scale pandemic response. Agile development methods are ideal when we don't and can't possibly know everything. They focus on delivering business value early and continuously, typically measured by working software. Effectively, this was the same for us, only we were delivering a working national COVID testing service. What this meant is our life cycle from design to build to deployment was extremely quick for a service of this nature and scale. For example, it was a matter of hours between prototypes to building the real thing. We moved from tape on the ground to one-to-one scale cardboard prototypes to a site being built using prefabricated materials within 24 hours. We also went from concepts and prototypes to a live service within weeks, focusing solely on delivering our core requirements and learning as we went. While delivering something early is important, continuous improvement was equally as important. Our approach was underpinned by continuously testing and learning from users and the service being live. For example, as opposed to spending weeks or months understanding and detailing all of the requirements before initiating delivery, we had to quickly estimate, prototype, and test the core requirements for the service and refine details as and when required. While additional features were identified throughout our design process, no features were actually defined in detail until they were prioritized as critical for delivery. This was also true of how we managed improvements and changes to the service once it was live. The team maintained a backlog of service improvements and various changes, which was prioritized based on feedback on how the live service was operating, with our changes being released on a regular cadence. Critical to this, however, was setting expectations and gaining agreement not only with our pilot partners, but also with those across the program, because nobody across the program and our pilot partners have really experienced this kind of delivery for this kind of service before. They had to agree that the thing we were delivering at pace. Not only was that the beginning, but it would also be iterated as we learned things. However, this could not have been done at the pace that was required with a large team. We were a small, nimble, cross-functional team that was ring-fenced and protected from other challenges playing out across the program, which meant we could focus purely on designing the initial asymptomatic testing, site-based testing service. So between the three of us, we brought a wide range of skills across user-centered design, architecture, strategy, operational and digital transformation and delivery, not to mention our innate number 8 wire Kiwi mentality of just being resourceful, pragmatic, and just getting stuck in. Comically, at one point when we were working with one of our pilot partners, we were repeatedly asked whether we had been sent by the New Zealand government to help with the UK's pandemic response. Something that we found very hilarious and amusing, but we were also really proud of at the same time. While we were focusing on an aspect of the program that the three of us were heavily involved in, we would not have been able to deliver such a service at the pace and scale that we did without the support of our wider team and our subject matter experts across the program. We had reach back and access to experts and a wider team as we were developing the service. They were able to provide the right input as required and address the wider things that we needed to have in place to enable us to roll the service out and scale it across the country whilst we focus purely on designing it. Finally, how our team gelled was so important, not only to our delivery, but also for our wider well-being. Our wee pandemic whānau wasn't afraid of challenging and really pushing each other, and particularly our ideas, but we also really supported each other too, which was incredibly important given the lengthy hours that we were working and the pressure that we were all under.
So we were forced to scale and scale rapidly. Now, I just want to set the scene a little bit. We'd been working tirelessly to get the service live for Christmas. On Christmas Eve, I received a phone call letting me know that the French had closed their borders to all UK logistics drivers and truckies. There were about 10,000 trucks backed up at Dover, and the situation was on the brink of a humanitarian crisis. We needed to set up testing immediately. train companies to do so, and deploy the resources needed. We came up with the training plan on the spot, and this went on to be delivered to thousands and thousands of people. So what happens when you're forced to scale in incredibly aggressive timeframes? Well, as a result of the pandemic, a lot of the work has moved virtually. We did try to use this as a means to scale early on, but it just simply didn't work. George has already talked about the benefit of being on site for designing the surface, but I also want to highlight the importance for scaling as well, as it helped us understand the sentiment of the ATS, like the finer behavioral elements of testing. This meant that we could be more sensitive to people's situations and respond in a far more lean and agile way. We went through two main phases as we scaled the service. Firstly was the iterative transition from pilots to self-sufficient rollout. The team was designing something that in the future needed to be self-sufficient. It was underpinned by the design principles of standardization where possible, which meant our services could be deployed in multiple settings across the 4 UK nations. The guidebook, or the onboarding and build your own test site instruction book, was a critical artifact in this. We would be able to take learnings from a diverse set of pilots in the early days to understand what did and didn't work. Then, as it scaled, we could form something that anyone in any context could use. Now, I just want to just highlight, never underestimate the power of doing something manually before it becomes a prescriptive automated process. For example, I ran training sessions with hundreds of people every day for about 4 or 5 weeks before we finally recorded it and incorporated it into the government website, simply for the fact that the design was changing on a daily basis. We were able to give guidance, make changes on the spot, and then we were able to feed all these learnings back into the design team. One of the impacts that this did cause, though, was the trust that people had in the guidance that we were giving. But because we were there in person, we had close relationships, we were able to explain the design process that we were using, and we were also able to provide the reassurance that people needed as well. Secondly, once the guidance and digital solution was stable enough, we were able to use existing channels and resources to reach as many people as we possibly could. This included government departments and their their industry bodies, aggregations of businesses to utilize their resources, so the likes of a business park, for example, local authorities and community testing, as well as pharmacy testing as well. We delivered a new self-test service, which was supported by an online ordering service, and this proved to be the most effective means of scaling to millions of tests per week. But it was only achievable once we had a certain amount of momentum in the rollout of testing across the UK. It was also made achievable with the support of the wider team, who had the brain space to step back, look at the wider testing strategy, and identify these opportunities that we could utilise.
So we'll sum up with a few final reflections on this unique design experience. What we've been reflecting has worked well in this scenario was effectively treating this product or this service as a startup. We were focused on meeting a market need. We applied lean principles. We needed to get to market quickly, but we could not compromise on quality. We applied a learn and iterate approach to designing the product. And then, of course, we needed to scale it. So here are a few last observations, which I hope will be helpful to some listening today. Firstly, have a laser focus on outcomes. Our team had a very clear mandate and remit to get that done however we needed to. We saw other teams across the wider program struggle where outcomes were fuzzy or too broad. This meant that they were either overwhelmed or their design could go round and round in circles. Our team focused on workplaces first, without concerning ourselves with long-term testing strategy or attempting to get testing live across all kinds of institutions at once. Secondly, we maintained the pragmatic attitude of a startup. We were not afraid to try things. We were not afraid to fail. We were not afraid to learn. And we did all of this without letting the fear of bureaucracy get in our way. And finally, this pragmatism extended to flexibility in roles and also in the work that our team was doing. So we had a just muck in attitude. Nobody was precious about this is my role, this is not my role. You had the confidence that you could pick something up and then put it down and move on, and somebody else in the team could come and pick it up from you. So we had very much an all hands on deck approach in a small multidisciplinary team, and it was extremely effective in this setting. That's it from us. Thank you all so much for your time and your attention. We are very happy to answer questions in the chat, or we can pick up offline because time zones might prove a little bit difficult later today. Thanks, everyone.